It's hard to find someone whose life hasn't been touched in some way by our fighting men and women. We hope and pray that those overseas will be taken care of well if injured. So it has been in every war, including the Korean War, the first to utilize the MASH, or Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. To truly understand the importance of this innovation, one must first recognize the background of military medicine and the challenges faced by doctors and nurses. As early as the Napoleonic Wars in France from 1799 to 1815, Baron Dominique Jean Léry recognized the problem of quickly giving surgical aid to those wounded at the front. He was one of the first physicians to bring medical support to the very front, and laid the foundation for MASHs with his concept of ambulance volante, or flying ambulance. In World War II, this concept translated to medical units following combat divisions as they advanced or retreated from the front. However, at the beginning of World War II in 1939, the most mobile Army medical unit wasn't mobile at all. Large fixed field hospitals comprised the medical facilities, necessitating ground evacuation from the combat zone. Many critical patients died en route in long ambulance transports. The newly formed Surgical Consultants Division, established to advise on matters of combat surgery, realized that this method was costing many lives. The chief consultant in surgery to the chief surgeon of the European Theater of Operations was Colonel Elliot Cutler. His previous experience, which included working as professor of surgery at Harvard University Medical School, convinced him of the benefit of forward surgery through a completely mobile surgical team that could function independently. With the rest of the Surgical Consultants Division, he recommended these, called Auxiliary Surgical Groups, to Brigadier General Paul R. Hawley, the chief surgeon of the European Theater of Operations, every chance he got. Early in 1943, the Surgeon General requested the formation of 4, eventually 5, Auxiliary Surgical Groups, or ASGs, in the European Theater of Operations. On paper, one of these groups was made up of teams of a chief surgeon, an assistant surgeon, an anesthetist, 1 nurse, and 2 enlisted men as technicians. 24 of the approximately 35 teams making up the group were for general surgery, and the rest were specialty teams: neurologic, maxillofacial, thoracic, plastic, and orthopedists. Teams supported division clearing stations, evacuation hospitals, or, most importantly, field hospitals. Field hospital platoons supported at least 1 division, if not more, and could require up to 6 teams each, which they relied upon for their entire surgical service. As the new groups tried their legs, some things were found to be lacking. Good documentation of the groups' operations helped to improve these. Despite these improvements, many took a lot of convincing as to the benefits of the ASGs. Platoon commanders disliked that the teams didn't come under their administrative control, and that their awkward position caused problems of transport and supply. After months of drilling and training, the ultimate test of the teams' worth came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The relatively inexperienced teams were attached to seaborne and glider-borne echelons and thrown into a wild tumult of frantic activity, some setting up surgeries in German garrisons by flashlights so as not to give away their position, some performing surgery under falling shells, and all having to improvise with few supplies and personnel, either at or only a mile or 2 from the front. As the dust settled, the benefits were clear. In 1 week following D-Day, the teams of 1 ASG treated over 900 patients alone, and they helped evacuate over 8,000. The influence of the teams was steadying and heartening to the men unused to such brutal combat. 22 days after D-Day, as an experiment, 5 mobile surgical units and 3 mobile X-ray units came to Normandy and were attached to the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group. These units moved in trucks and carried all of their own supplies. The 1944 annual report to the Surgeon General from the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group writes of these: "The mobile surgical units cannot function independently. They have proved useful to a limited extent." ASGs had reduced morbidity and mortality significantly. After the fascist powers were defeated and most troops returned home, the United States Army Medical Department took stock of the Auxiliary Surgical Groups' well-documented work, ultimately deciding to combine the ASGs and mobile surgical units. 5 of these mobile Army surgical hospitals were staffed in America between 1948 and 1950. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The U.S. immediately sent troops from Japan to block the communist invasion, involving 21 UN countries in an international conflict. 3 MASHs supporting 4 U.S. infantry divisions were deployed as well. These MASHs followed the front no less than 20 miles, and often as close as 3 or 4 miles behind. When the time came to bug out, the unit was packed and ready within 6 hours. It moved in 2 phases, sending half the Tentagen personnel ahead of the rest, and so for a short time 2 completely functional hospitals existed. The front half was operational within 4 hours once it had arrived at the new location. Road conditions, along with a violent fighting situation, made the original design of the evacuation hospitals impossible to carry out, so the MASH was modified from its 60-bed non-transportables capacity to a 200-bed capacity. However, this was not matched by an increase in personnel. The only way to keep up was rapid evacuation. One MASH could handle over 400 patients a day. An ambulance platoon was attached to each unit to facilitate swift patient conveyance to and from the unit. For the first time in combat, helicopters were used for evacuation, a product of World War II's aeromedical evacuations by plane. The hospital itself consisted of a basic U of tents, comprised of a receiving section, pre-operative ward, laboratory and X-ray area, surgery area, post-operative ward, evacuation section, and an administrative section. Fields and rocky roads provided an area for ambulances and helicopters to bring patients. The hospital staff was comprised of about 4 general surgeons, including the chief surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, a maxillofacial surgeon, 1 or 2 anesthesiologists, about 3 nurse anesthetists, 5 nurses, and about 10 technicians. Half of the unit's staff rotated on 12-hour shifts, on occasion working all together, should the patient load necessitate it. Once a patient was received from the offloading ambulance or helicopter, he was brought into the receiving tent and examined by the triage officer. X-rays, labs, and IVs were ordered, if needed, and staff would attempt to stabilize his condition. After moving to the pre-operative ward, personnel removed his clothing and put him in a gown. The operating room was prepared, and the patient brought to the pole frame that, together with the litter, made an operating table. The nurse anesthetist put the patient to sleep and worked with 1 or 2 surgeons, 2 technicians, and the OR nurse to heal the patient. After the surgery was completed, the patient was moved to the post-operative ward, and as soon as possible to a rear evacuation hospital, or back to the front. While similar to previous methods, this treatment of patients was clearly superior. Though the end of the Korean War in 1953 was only 8 years after the end of World War II, little time for medical advancement, the casualty statistics told the story. There were 565,861 men wounded in World War II. Of those, 20,810 died. Part to whole, that's 3.7% of men dying after being wounded. In the Korean War, 77,596 were wounded, and 1,887 died. Part to whole, that's 2.4%, a decrease of more than 1%. If the mortality rate had stayed the same in the Korean War, we'd be looking at 2,871 men dead. Do the math. That's another almost 1,000 men who get to live another day and go home to see their families. How's that for impact? MASHs continued to serve the Army in Vietnam, the 1991 Gulf War, and the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The innovations of the MASH during the Korean War were not effectively matched in the civilian world for another 15 to 20 years. The combined effort in trauma management through helicopter evacuation and paramedics formed the model for metropolitan trauma centers today. In November 1995, Colonel Michael E. DeBakey, who had received the Legion of Merit for his help in developing the MASH, gave a speech entitled History, the Torch That Illuminates, Lessons from Military Medicine. In it, he quoted the chief consultant of the chief surgeon of the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, Colonel Edward D. Churchill, from a speech in 1951. All military medicine, insofar as civilians are concerned, is a discontinuous specialty. Consequently, in every new war, the same stupid mistakes are made again, and soldiers lose their lives and limbs, because the doctor was ignorant of past experience. I cannot overemphasize the need to study military medicine and surgery. DeBakey added, "It is evident that we should consistently record and analyze each medical military experience, and incorporate into further plans lessons learned from such analyses. That is, after all, the way we practice all medicine. In this case, learning from history means a bit more than a history teacher telling you that it's important to. Learning from history can mean the difference between lives lost and lives saved." The last MASH in South Korea was deactivated in 1997, and the last in the world, the 212th MASH, was converted to a Combat Support Hospital, or CASH, a smaller casualty surgical hospital intended to be deployed even closer to the front lines than the MASH, in October 2006. Though the MASH is gone, its effects will never be forgotten. The MASH-developed doctrine revolutionized and defined the standard of practice in the US and the rest of the developed world.